Okay then. Ah, those disciples. Ah, those Zebedee brothers. How does this happen? Jesus, the disciples, and the others going along on the way to Jerusalem. People were amazed, presumably at his teaching and his healing and his ministry. And they were afraid, presumably because they did get at least a little of what was being asked of them. So Jesus takes the 12 aside, and here's the third time in Mark when Jesus predicts his passion, as the commentators say, tells the end of the story. And here's the third time in Mark that the disciples respond in less than good student fashion. How did James and John, how do we go from hearing this puzzling prediction of the end after having heard it twice already with additional instructions both times? How do they go from hearing that to asking what they asked for? The first time, chapter 8, Mark has Jesus add, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." In chapter 9, the disciples had an argument about who was greatest, and Jesus responded, "Whoever wants to be first must be last and servant." He already said that once. So how is it? No, maybe it's better to ask, why is it that Mark has this special request from the Zebedee boys right after this third prediction? Why is that? "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. Grant us to sit close to the throne." Perhaps y'all don't remember way back to July 12th. That was when we had that funny reading, that sad reading about the beheading of John the Baptist. Herod said to his stepdaughter, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give that to you." We're supposed to remember to make that connection way back. Herodias asked for the head of John the Baptist. Wily, devious, cruel, callous. Mark has the boys use very parallel language to lift up the irony that they are unwittingly positioning themselves alongside the very rulers who execute righteous teachers. The gospel writers were very powerful storytellers. But what is it exactly that James and John are asking for? Clearly, it's about power, prestige, places near the top, which means, of course, they haven't been listening very well. The last shall become first. Become like a child. Take up your cross. You know, friends, it's really hard to give up one's long-held dreams, beliefs, assumptions. These first-century middle-class guys had hitched their wagon to the Jesus star. The miracle worker, the teacher, the revolutionary. They had glimpsed the possibilities of the overthrow of hated Roman domination. They had a very real image of the place in the world that their faith and their people would finally have. Well, since all scripture is timeless, this is about us as well. Don't we also have a really hard time releasing the dreams and the hopes that maybe we once had? While most clergy strive mightily to lift up for our people the ever-present God in the midst of this crazy transition time that the church is in, when clergy get together, we often bemoan the reality that when those of us were ordained 20 or 25 or 30 years ago, we couldn't imagine that the time would come during our working years when many churches could no longer afford full-time clergy, when in fact church would become a kind of footnote in society. Excuse me, when God might require professional and personal creativity in recreating ministry, while at the same time taking care of our families. Damn if we aren't just as bad as those Zebedee boys. As one of the commentators said in their request, those boys are going with the same old categories and assumptions they've always had, just inserting themselves into the places of prestige and power. So instead of growing closer to Jesus' radical vision of the reign of God, they prove that they have not left all when they turn to follow him. Some nets are just harder to let go of than others. The nets of their understanding of the Messiah, those secret nets of desire for personal power and glory, of use and manipulation of those we know to get what we want. Those are the nets the disciples hadn't quite let go of. I just hate looking at this passage and holding it up next to my own life, my own nets, if you will, that I haven't let go of. Most days I hate working so hard to keep trying to figure out how to invite others to join us here at St. Peter's. And when I feel like that, I'm ashamed at my faithlessness. I say to you all the time that this is God's church, not any one family's or any one group's. So I say out loud right now to remind myself again, this is not my church either. It's God's. And therefore it's only as together we continue growing in that old let go, let God, that we can trust that God will take us where we need to go. So just to note in passing, another wonderful stroke of writing genius in Mark. In chapter 8, just before Jesus' first prediction of the end, there's the story of the blind man at Bethsaida, on whose eyes Jesus put his own saliva to bring his vision back. Next week, we get a reading about the healing of the blind man in Jericho. No coincidence that framing these three predictions of the end, these 3 times the disciples don't get it, no coincidence that it starts with the ability to see coming to outsiders of that in-group. Okay, so